welcome to our interview today. My name is Marianne Kannengies, and here today with me is Dr. Isaac Golden. I'm very happy to have you talk to us today. And dear Isaac, may I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, and as you can see from the way I'm dressed, I'm in the middle of winter while you're in the middle of summer, I think.
Yes, I'm intrigued.
Yes. Yes, I've been involved with homeopathy for about 35 years. I started practicing 1984, and I started homeoprophylaxis in 1985 after reading some of Hahnemann's works. Now, I'm in my 70s, so there was quite a few years before I started, and my original professional training was in economics and finance and financial accounting, very different to homeopathy, but I always loved natural medicine. I had a great feeling for it. I used to vaccinate my children, and one of them was vaccine injured. This is before I knew about homeopathy, and so that changed how I accepted orthodox medical advice without question. I started researching. Some years after that, I decided to change my career path into natural medicine, and I started with things like the Schussler tissue salts, flower essences, herbal medicines, nutritional medicines. But when I discovered homeopathy, I fell in love, like many of us have. And but I still didn't know about homeopathic immunisation or homeoprophylaxis. And it wasn't until I read Hahnemann's lesser writings and his essay, The Cure and Prevention of Scarlet Fever. And that made such an impression on me because of my own personal experience with my daughter. And I just thought, well, if other parents knew what I now know, that there's actually options to preventing potentially serious infectious diseases without causing harm, then they would have choices. And so that's when I really started what's been the last 35 years of my life. I designed a program, a prophylaxis program, to mimic at that time the Australian vaccination schedule, which of course was much, much smaller than it is now. And I've changed that a few times over the years. Now, because of my background in statistics, I realised that even though we had 200 years of if you like, data or evidence from practitioners in old journals, we didn't have statistics, we didn't have data. So I started collecting data from the people in Australia who are using my program. Now, my program was different to Hahnemann's in the sense that it wasn't an epidemic program. It was an endemic program. In other words, for diseases that were there in the background the whole time, whooping cough. At that time, I covered diphtheria, tetanus, etc. And it's been a different data set to the bulk of the information that's been acquired over the years. And for example, last year, I published a couple of articles in peer-reviewed journals which talked about the use of homeoprophylaxis in 3 countries. That was India, Cuba, and Brazil, in about 26 different interventions. And that covered over 250 million people on an annualized basis. So we went from having 15 years ago, very, very little data, to now having massive amounts of data. And the one thing that stands out, even though orthodox people will criticise the data, and every data set is capable of being criticised, everyone, there's consistency. And that's really the thing that shines through the data we have for homeoprophylaxis. There's wonderful consistency between different diseases, different countries, small interventions, large interventions, and also there's consistency between the epidemic use of the remedies as well as my endemic use. So in one of the articles last year, I didn't attempt to quantify and summarize all of that body of data, and it showed an effectiveness between about 85 and 90%. And that certainly is very comparable to vaccines. And it comes without any risk of toxic damage, without increasing a burden of chronic illness in a community. So it really is a genuine option for parents, but more importantly, and very sadly, it's a wonderful potential option for governments. But so few governments around the world have their eyes open to see it, because the international pharmaceutical drug cartels really control most health systems in most so-called developed countries. And it just prevents the politicians in those countries from really seeing what the genuine options are. And it's such a shame. So I went to Cuba first in 2008, and I went back 3 more times there, working with the people at the Finlay Institute. Now, these are real scientists, and the president, Dr. Concepcion Campo-Huergo, everyone calls her Conchita. She is a lovely person. She is like Cuba's version of Mother Teresa, actually. She's totally unselfish, totally devoted to helping people. She was president of Finlay Institute for many years. She was a very good friend of Fidel. They used to communicate regularly, and he gave her a lot of support. And she was the pioneer, really, of using homeoprophylaxis in Cuba. And then her vice president, Dr. Gustavo Bracho, a wonderful man, very intelligent, who's now living, interestingly, in Australia, not in the same region as I am, but he's moved here. He was the person she put in charge of leading the homeoprophylaxis interventions. Now, he was not a homeopath. He was an expert in vaccine adjuvants. But these people, they were genuine scientists, even though they didn't understand how it worked. And in orthodox terms, we can't explain how homeopathy in general works. One day we will, but not at the moment. But they saw that it did work, and that was what they needed. And that's why they rolled out with leptospirosis in 2007 and again in 2008, large interventions in 2.2 million people. And actually, the interesting thing is that the current president of Cuba was the director of one of the 3 provinces back in 2007, 2008, where the leptospirosis interventions occurred. And he saw firsthand how effective they were and what a difference they made. And I'm sure he's behind the fact that in Cuba now, for coronavirus, they are rolling out an option. They've covered over 5 million people so far, and I'm sure they'll end up getting the whole country covered. So things changed there a bit in 2015. Dr. Campa ceased being the president of Finlay, and it reverted more back to vaccines. But they still have the capacity there to do big interventions. And from 2015 onwards, I've been to India 5 times researching there, because they've done marvellous work in homeopathy, massive homeoprophylaxis interventions. And in fact, the reason I went there first was because I heard about a huge intervention in 20 million people against Japanese encephalitis in Andhra Pradesh province. And I thought, that's too good to be true, a bit hard to believe, because it was in children under 15 years of age. I then subsequently found out Andhra Pradesh had over 96 million people, so a quarter of them being children of that age made total sense. And I went to meet some of the people who were involved in that and collected a lot of data, and that an update on that was also published last year. And so that's where the figures have come from. And Brazil, who are struggling with coronavirus at the moment, they've done some wonderful interventions with meningococcal disease and dengue fever, and the other countries as well. So what I published was the tip of the iceberg. It wasn't in any way an attempt to quantify all of the prophylaxis interventions, because that would be impossible. But the consistency is the key thing between both the epidemic as well as the endemic use of the method. Sorry, that was a long-winded introduction.
Yes, but absolutely okay. I just wondered, when you talked about all those countries, did you work in Africa too?
I've never been to Africa, but there has been work in Africa. I know that, but I've never been there.
Because the Kenyan and the Ugandan people, they are really suffering.
Yes. Yeah.
It's tremendous suffering in Africa at the moment.
And it seems to be, almost constant there. And there are some wonderful homeopaths doing work in Africa. But of course, some governments support what they do, others don't. And I don't want to talk too much about reasons why. But there are obvious reasons why in some of the countries they're more open and other countries less open.
Yeah. So going back to homeoprophylaxis,
Yep.
Before we started the interview, we talked about a veterinarian colleague, late veterinarian colleague, Dr. Johann Joseph Wilhelm Lux, who lived the same time as Hahnemann lived and was called the father of esopathy. And maybe you want to say something to that.
Yes, it's an interesting point, isopathy. See, to me, isopathy should mean potency of the same. In other words, if a person has, say, a respiratory disorder, you take some of their sputum, you make a potency of it, and you give it back to them as a remedy. Or if they have some blood disorder, which may not even be discovered or known, you can make a potency of blood and give it back to them as a remedy. Or feces, skin, urine, all of these things are possible. And to me, that's really what the meaning of isopathy is. And Hahnemann talked about it, and I can't quote, I'm not clever enough to remember all the exact quotes, but he talked about potentizing the same in a couple of places. At one place, he said he didn't want it to happen. He didn't like it at all. But then in another place, he talked about, well, is it really exactly the same? Even when you potentize it, it's a little bit different. Now, if we're talking about, for example, something like the whooping cough nosode, which I use in my endemic HP programs in Australia, there's no way in the world that is exactly the same. What a lovely pussycat. What's the pussy's name?
May I introduce baby Juno?
That's beautiful. I've kept mine out of the room, actually, because one of them's a little bit crazy. But, going back to isopathy. So I prefer to use the term isopathy when we're talking about potentizing exactly the same. So what I was saying is that if, for example, you're using the whooping cough nosode, it's not the same. It's almost certainly a different strain. It might only be slightly different, but it's still a different strain. And it's certainly not the patient's own material that's being potentized. So, look, putting that aside, because there are some academic homeopaths around the world who write thousands and thousands of words about very technical stuff, semantics. From my point of view, I'm not really interested in semantics. I'm interested more in evidence of whether something does work. So from my point of view, Burnett, who was the first person to use the term homeoprophylaxis, he basically called it prevention using similars. And that's a beautiful, simple explanation. And there's a whole range of ways that we can prevent targeted infectious diseases using the principle of similars. And so I don't lose any sleep at night as to whether or not what I'm doing fits with Hahnemann's views, because Hahnemann was the first one to use the principle of similars to prevent an infectious disease, belladonna, scarlet fever. So the ways that we can do it, there are four main ways. One is using genus epidemicus remedies, which is what Hahnemann did. The remedy that can cure belladonna, the remedy that can cure scarlet fever, belladonna, can also be used to prevent something which can produce similar symptoms to the symptoms of what we're trying to prevent, which is scarlet fever in that case. Or you can use nosodes. So if, for example, we're wanting to prevent whooping cough, you can use the whooping cough nosode. Or you can use a collection of remedies. Now, this is a little bit unusual. This was what's been used in the largest ever homeoprophylaxis intervention, which was the Japanese encephalitis in Andhra Pradesh, which also then split later to Telangana. I can always pronounce that incorrectly. But they used a series of 3 remedies over a month, different remedies, belladonna, calcarb, tuberculinum. So they called it the BCT. And the remedies were used for different purposes. The belladonna was more of a GE. The calcarb was more like a constitutional. The tuberculinum was an anti-miasmic. And they did that from 1999 to 2009. And each year they were covering around about 20 million children. It wasn't all the same children, because each year some got old and past the age they were doing it, and each year a new cohort was born. So it would have covered roughly about 30 million different people over that period of time, maybe 35. And so that's another way of doing it. And the final way of doing it is what the Cubans do. And this is what I personally think, at this point of time at least, is the best way of confronting COVID virus. And what the Cubans did with a number of different diseases, but particularly with their latest one, 2014, when I was there for the last time, I remember talking to Dr. Bracho about the formulation of their new Cuban remedy, prophylaxis remedy for dengue. And they combined the 4 major strains, the nosodes, if you like, of the 4 major strains. In fact, there were 4 major groups. In fact, there were 14 different actual different remedies that were combined for the nosode. And then they used a combination of genus epidemicus remedies. And with dengue, it's difficult, because the first attack of dengue, it's more like a Eupatorium perfoliatum type case. They're usually fairly mild, they're usually fairly easily treated, but with subsequent attacks, they can become very serious. People can develop dengue hemorrhagic fever. And so we were looking at remedies like the reptile remedies in particular, which have that hemorrhagic effect, phosphorus, etc. So they made a combination of these different strains of the dengue virus that were circulating in Cuba, as well as a combination of GE remedies. Now, I wrote a little article that was published in that online journal, hpathy.com. It's freely available, and they have some wonderful articles there. So I wrote a little article back in February, and I think it was published in March, talking about what I would do if I was allowed to do things in Australia. And I know that's one thing you wanted to briefly talk about, the situation here and that dreadful report that emanated from here. I'm very happy to talk about that. So I really think at the moment, when we're talking about preventing COVID, the best approach is the Cuban approach. And for this reason, when we look at what homeopaths around the world who are treating COVID are doing, 3 remedies emerge as the GE. Arsenicum album, bryonia, and gelsemium. They're the top 3. Now, a few other remedies have been suggested, but they're certainly the top 3. So if you're only using one, which one? Then, if we're going to talk about using the corona nosode, and I know that there are a number of places which are advertising coronavirus nosodes, how were they made? What was the raw material? And then, even if they can tell us that, I bet they don't know which strain it was. And then the problem with the strains with corona is that we don't know 2 things. We don't know if a person who gets infected with one strain is going to be immune from all the other strains, as is normal with most infectious diseases. We haven't determined that yet. And we haven't determined, which is the most important thing from a homeoprophylaxis point of view, whether or not the different strains produce similar symptoms. Are we getting different GE pictures because they're different strains? Now, if that's the case, then using only one strain will not be adequate. You see, if the different strains were producing similar symptoms, one strain, it wouldn't matter which one you used, one strain would cover, because it's based on the principle of similars. I mean, our job in preventing disease is so much easier than the vaccine manufacturers. They have to get a lock and key between the antigen and the antibodies. We don't. We have to get a match. How similar are the common symptoms of the disease compared with the common symptoms of the remedy, whether it's GE or nosode, that we're using? So this is why I like the idea of using the Cuban approach at the moment. Now, as we find out more about COVID, maybe in a few months' time, the orthodox people will tell us, okay, we've identified all these different strains, and the strains have a common symptom picture, and therefore that makes the job a lot easier. Or if they say the strains don't have a common symptom picture, then we need to be really flexible. But to me, a combination remedy makes sense. Now, when I first went to Cuba in 2008, I regard myself as pretty much a classical homeopath. When I'm treating, I use one remedy at a time, with usually spaced, apart from drainage and things like that, or acutes, but generally a single remedy. And when I first went to Cuba, there were a group of doctors from Homeopaths Without Borders. Most of them were from Canada. And I went to have a meal at the hotel on the first night, and they were all there, and they said, "Oh, you're Isaac from Australia? Yes, come over and join us." And they had a lot of amusement at my expense that night, because they said, "Do you know that the Cubans make combinations of everything?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." I didn't even know the Cubans were doing anything with homeoprophylaxis when I was invited there to the big conference in Havana in the end of 2008. And I was shocked to find they were using my protocols. That's why they invited me. But so that was a real lesson I had to learn very, very quickly, that it may not be pure classical homeopathy, but gee, it works. And it is in accordance with the principle of similars. And the other thing is, if we use a combination remedy and we prove it, then we can apply it like a constitution, like a traditional remedy in homeopathy, because we can say, okay, here's the symptom picture, and this is the symptom picture we want to prevent, and so they're similar. Therefore, we can use them based on the principle of similars without any criticism at all. But, you know, we'll see. Anyway, sorry, you were asking me about isopathy. So whether I'm criticised for being an isopath or whatever, I don't care. I mean, obviously, GE remedies aren't isopathic because they're mainly made from plants, or sometimes, like Arsenicum album, metals. So they're obviously not isopathic. And I would still argue that even when you use nosodes, you're not using the same. You're using very, very similar, and that's why they work, but you're not using the same. So I personally wouldn't call them isopathic remedies, but I know a lot of people do, so, you know, so be it.
This is the point where Luke started from, that he was, in reality, he was the one of the first veterinarians to effectively treat pandemics within animals. It was the bovine plague at that time, and he was the best one to treat it. And he said that if you take the excretes of one cow and you treat another cow with that, it still is a similimum, not an equalium.
Yeah.
That was.
And did he end up thinking that, or did he change his view?
No, he didn't change his view. In fact, he got in a lot of quarrels with so-called classical homeopaths who did envy him a lot. And finally, he ended up in selling all his books to the universities and retreated to his garden, where he did work with apple trees. and he
Ah,
was one of the famous pomologists then at that time. So he
yes. Well, I
completely
totally
went off
agree with him.
homeopathy.
Well, I'm not going to do that, but I totally agree with his opinion, and I think he showed great wisdom well ahead of his time.
Yes, yes, I think so.
So thank you
And
for bringing his name to my memory again. I've heard the name, but I haven't studied him. I think I will now.
there's not much material. I tried to do my thesis on him, but it wasn't enough material.
Ah,
This is why I know quite a lot
oh,
about him. He was a
yes.
quite irritable person, just as Hahnemann, quite illustrious person.
Yes.
And obviously got in a lot of quarrels. And as we know, we still have the quarrels within homeopaths till now.
Yes.
And
Well, I have to say that someone who I greatly admire, Professor George Vithulkas, he and I had a series of debates in H-pathy back in 2007, I think it was, and they're still available for people to have a look at. But they were very polite because George was basically saying that homeopathy only works through treating. And I was basically saying, well, I don't care what you say, but we have evidence that prophylaxis works. And not just prophylaxis in the immediate face of an epidemic, but long-term endemic prophylaxis works. So we had to agree to disagree, but it was a very polite and respectful disagreement, and we occasionally still exchange emails because I have an enormous respect for him. On the other hand, there are certain other what I would call academic homeopaths, and I won't mention any names here, it's not appropriate, who have said dreadful things about not only myself, but other people who use prophylaxis and made, terrible assertions about morals and all that sort of stuff. Well, when I see people, how grateful they are that they have a choice, and this is,
definitely,
in my own country, but when I read about and see the millions of people being protected in other countries, I mean, anyone who criticizes this method, whichever form of prophylaxis is used, are being very, very short-sighted. Hahnemann was a really practical man. He wanted to help people. He wanted to prevent suffering, and that's all that this is about. That's the only bottom line, preventing suffering.
definitely. And Hahnemann was an adventurer and totally inventive spirit.
Yeah.
And he never would have liked that we were stuck with his method and not think further. He wouldn't have liked that.
Well, I still think that, what I've talked about, even the 4 different types of prophylaxis, are still his method. I mean, the key to Hahnemann's method is the principle of similars.
Yeah.
Now, if something's done within the principle of similars, honestly done, then to me it's homeopathic. So you can have arguments, semantic arguments, in all sorts of ways. But the bottom line for me is it similar? Is it based on the principle of similars? And with homeoprophylaxis, the remedies have to be chosen according to the principle of similars. Otherwise, they won't work. Simple as that.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing you said was very touching to me. When you combine different remedies and a nosode and you do a proving on that, then it's absolute classical homeopathy, because then it's a
Yeah,
combination which is looked upon as one. Because when you
as a single
potentize
remedy.
a plant, it consists of
Mm,
many things.
absolutely. Yep.
And
And
then
so
you're
that's
doing,
what we have to do. Yeah, is get provings done of many more nosodes and things like that. And there's some interesting attempts at expanding, actually, the range of nosodes, the quality of nosodes that are going on. And, or God willing, the coronavirus will be a trigger for something really positive and beneficial. I mean, there's so much suffering that's been caused by it, as much by fear and economic shutdowns and things like that as actual medical things. But there's been so much suffering caused. I can only hope that there will be a blessing at the end, in that our knowledge about this whole area and our ability to deliver really high quality materials will have expanded in the next couple of years. And there are certainly things happening which may bring that about.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. And what you said about the different strains of the coronavirus, as a veterinarian, I'm absolutely sure that we are dealing with a lot of strains. It won't be able to cover it with one nosode.
Yeah. And that's where what the Cubans did with dengue is totally appropriate. And it's interesting. I mean, I can't go into too much more, but there's a lot of work going on in the background. So let's hope, God willing, that it will be successful and something really positive will come out of this.
I hope so too.
So can we talk about that dreadful Australian report?
Just what I wanted to ask you this moment. Please go.
Good. Okay. And I love my country, and I think I'm very blessed to be in this country. But the one weakness of Australia more than anything else is that the health system here is totally closed-minded. It's worse than America. You'd think that, the home of the big pharma, etc., and so many other things would be worse than here, but it's not. We're actually more closed-minded in terms of our health system. Now, parts of our health system are absolutely marvellous. I mean, our acute emergency system, the doctors and nurses working there do amazing work. It is literally world-class. But we have a huge rate of chronic illness in this country, which you never hear the newspapers talk about. They talk about, wonderful advances that in 5 or 10 years' time will save so many people. They never talk about the real hard facts of the true health of the Australian population. And many other developed countries are very similar. We have, when the Australian Bureau of Statistics used to publish the figures, we had at least 2/3 of all Australians having at least one chronic disease, and 40% of children 14 years and under had at least one chronic disease. So, if almost half of your children start their lives with chronic illness, I mean, where is the rest of the population going to go? So, to me, the culprit are the pharmaceutical drug cartels. And I don't say that out of conspiracy theories, because I really detest conspiracy theories. But there was a series of articles published by Harvard University Law School back in 2013. They published 16 different articles in a law journal. They'd spent a team there in the SAFRA ethics lab within the school had spent 5 years studying the influence of the pharmaceutical drug cartels on every aspect of health. They looked mainly at America, but it was all, of course, worldwide. And it showed how captured medical education was, how orthodox doctors would say, we know all about it and we make sure we're not affected by it, but they weren't, how they had taken over forums that appeared to be consumer forums and appeared to be medical forums, how research had been so corrupted. Anyway, in 2013, there was a group formed in Australia called the Friends of Science and Medicine. Totally inappropriate name. It should have been called the Friends of Pharmaceuticals in Medicine, if they were being honest. Their first goal their stated goal was to stop universities researching about natural medicine in general or teaching natural medicine. So much for being scientists. They were totally closed-minded. And this group, who consist of 1,000+ highly esteemed academics, were the ones who really infiltrated our NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council, which published that very damning report on homeopathy some years ago, and who then followed that up by publishing reports on 16 other natural medicines, including naturopathy, herbal medicine, even yoga and massage, saying there was no evidence of effectiveness. Now, it's the old statistical fiddle where if you do a survey and you restrict the evidence from there to there, you can say, well, we've looked at the evidence and there's nothing there because they haven't looked at everything else. And that's basically what they did. It was really interesting because they employed a highly regarded academic in this area from Adelaide University to do the first study. The first study found there was evidence. The day after she gave them the draft of the first study, they sacked her. And then they tried to suppress the fact that there was a first study, which we eventually found out using freedom of information. But they then employed a different group, and partway through that analysis, the different group must have been finding the same thing because they then changed the parameters of the research. And as you would know, that you don't do that. And the reason you don't do it is to stop the researchers from fiddling the figures. So if you look at the NHMRC website, it makes it sound like they actually looked at 1,600 different studies. They made their conclusion based on 5 studies, 5 out of 1,000. And of course, they picked the 5 that they wanted to show that homeopathy had no evidence of effectiveness. But then even worse, they employed 3 peer reviewers and the Australasian Cochrane collaboration to look at their work. 2 of the peer reviewers and Cochrane came back and said, you should not publish the findings. Your conclusions don't fit the data. But they still went ahead and published it. And we've heard last year that there is a whistleblower prepared to come forward and say that when the NHMRC found that the Australian Homeopathic Association and some collaborators had referred what they'd done to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, because we saw this as scientific fraud, they then ordered documents to be destroyed. So that's, to me, one of the most serious accusations against them. I don't know if that will be covered by the Ombudsman or not. So these people committed serious scientific fraud, and I am ashamed as an Australian to have to say that, because they belittle the good work that many Australian researchers do. And really, it was the corrupting influence of this Friends of Science and Medicine, who originally, the head of the study on homeopathy was a member of the Friends, who were sworn opposition to natural medicine and particularly homeopathy. They really hate us. And then when that was exposed, he stood down as chair, but he still didn't leave the committee. So, you know, it's a very disappointing, very, very disappointing episode in the history of research in medicine in Australia. Now, we're still waiting for the Ombudsman's report to be released. It's taken years, but the Ombudsman appears to be doing a very careful and genuine job, and that will be wonderful. But you can imagine the pressure that's being brought onto the Ombudsman not to find against Australia's peak medical research body. It must be enormous in the background. Yeah. But we're hoping this year that the finding will come out. And already the first report has been released, so people have been able to see what was said in the first report. Of course, that didn't lead to retractions of the negative comments about homeopathy around the world. It should have, but it didn't, I'm sure. But if the Ombudsman produces a very open and honest report, then we will have something that we can say to the rest of the world, this report was not only wrong, it was intentionally wrong and false, and homeopathy, it's not perfectly proven by any means. There's still always work to be done, but we do have a massive body of evidence supporting the fact that it does work. given that we still can't explain how it works in orthodox terms that are acceptable, even though a lot of people are working on nanotechnology, they're working on memory of water, all this sort of stuff. We can't say that we can explain it in orthodox terms. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means that orthodox language is not capable of explaining an energetic medicine. But we can prove statistically that it does work. And you know, the interesting thing about homeoprophylaxis, it probably has the best evidence of all, because we're dealing with government agencies and we're dealing with hundreds of millions of people across a whole range of diseases. And that's massive, the data there. It's not like 20 people or 100 here or even 1,000 there. We're talking tens of millions of people. So we will see.
And I hope we will see, we'll definitely, how is it called, this Damocles sword of compulsory vaccination.
Yes. Oh.
will pass by. And we will hope.
Well, you know, my real hope is that something will happen to show enough governments that homeopathy actually can offer safe protection against COVID, and that any sort of a sword at all is absolutely unnecessary. Now, that can be shown in half a dozen countries unambiguously. Then even if there are other countries, including my own, that are not prepared to accept homeoprophylaxis for the whole country, at least it will make it that much more difficult to make it mandatory when people can point and say it is not essential, there is an option. And I'll tell you what, I bet when or if, and it is an if a vaccine for COVID is produced, it won't be as effective as what we can do. Now, we can expect the prophylaxis against COVID to be around 80 to 90%. And even Trump's little weasel who does his medical work, I forget his name, Fauci, even Fauci said that if he got 70% effectiveness in a vaccine, he'd be happy. Well, I reckon it'll probably be closer to the flu vaccine, which is only 40% in a good year. So, you know, we really will have a good story to tell. And let's just hope that we can, there'll be enough countries that will use homeoprophylaxis and produce enough data to prove to the world there is a safe option, because we have a safe option. Right now, we have a safe option.
I guess with the African countries, we might have an option to show the world because they can't afford anything else.
Yep. And the South American, Cuba is doing it. Big parts of India are doing it. And it's not all of India. There's so many people, but they're certainly in Kerala. You look at what they're doing down there south, because they love homeopathy in Kerala. You know, they've got a very low rate. So, you know, all well and God willing, things will show up. Truth will be revealed. And that's my prayer that I say every morning, please may truth be known. Because if we have the truth, that's all we need. We have nothing to hide. Homeopathy has nothing to hide. No. We're not keeping secrets.
Yeah, we all hope that eventually the truth and homeopathy will prevail.
Yeah. It's been lovely chatting with you.
Yeah, Isaac, is there anything else you want to say? Anything else that is on your heart which is important to be said?
The things that are mainly on my heart we've talked about already. And so obviously the corona issue and how we can promote HP, they're the things most on my heart at the moment. And because there's so much good that can be done for so many people at so little cost.
Would you like to be connected to a few organizations in Africa who care for children and try the no-so there? The homeoprophylaxis there?
Yes, I mean, without a doubt. If it's allowed to be done, I'd be very, very interested in that, because, you know, there is a little organisation which would be ready now to carry that out, actually. So yes, by
Yes,
all means, please,
I'm
please do.
connected to a few African organizations, mostly private schools and people who
Okay.
care for disabled children, and in Uganda as well. And I will connect you to them.
Yes, look, please do. That would be wonderful, and yeah, that would be a wonderful opportunity. Now, I have to say this last thing very, very carefully, because in my own country, if I talk about me preventing anything, I can be prosecuted, put to jail, literally. But if I was going to use something, um, I would actually then do a little study just to see how safe it was, and we know it's non-toxic, and in time to judge how effective it was. Now, in Australia, it's very hard to do an efficacy study because there's so few cases. But if I was doing something to find out how safe it was, I would expect to find that there would be very few reactions, but there would be some, and the reactions would be very brief and mild. And when you analyse the reactions, the symptoms would appear to be very similar to the symptoms we're trying to prevent in COVID. And but to be able to do that openly in an African country, etc., as well as giving the protection, of course, would be very, very lovely to do.
I will connect you.
So I have to be a little bit strange in the way I say that.
Yes, and I understand absolutely. It's a word of people who know what is right and is wrong, and they are so proud of it, and still there's so little consciousness about what's really going on.
Yeah, very true. Very, very true.
Isaac, thank you very much. Thank you very
Thank you.
much, and we will meet again.
I'll leave you with your beautiful cat.
Yes, and he wanted something to eat. That's why he came.
Oh, okay. Well, now he can be fed. Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
All the
so
best.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.